Yes, I'm with Southern and David Warr, yes, ex-president of Chamber of Commerce. For a couple of years you were on Chamber.
Yes, sure.
The discussion we're going to have is about what we might in a different place call labour relations. I don't know if they call them that in Jersey. But for some reason, there's a frustration that seems to enter the discussion whenever it's trade unions negotiating for wages, elements of aggravation. And now there are elements of aggravation on the other side, employers and employees. But why is it so? After all these years, nothing unusual, everybody has to work at some point in their life, they go to work. Why is there aggravation? Why is it with the states, for example, one of the major employers in the island, why is there confrontation, or what appears to be confrontation, with teachers? I mean, why teachers? I mean, everybody, we've got to have teachers. They're saying teachers are an essential part of the community. Why can there possibly be aggravation about agreeing their terms and conditions, engagement, their wages at this stage in the game?
Well, over the past few years, every time the Treasurer wants to save a little bit of money, he decides to impose a pay freeze on the public sector. And he's overriding the expectation that pay will go up with the cost of living, having been set through negotiations at what we believe to be a fair level. That consensus has come about. Presumably the employers have agreed that at some point. Are they now, in this particular instance, as teachers, are they actually changing the rules, or are they just renegotiating? I think they are. I think they're trying to exploit the situation in the UK where there's been a pay freeze, and they think that they'll maintain the differentials rather than maintaining a fair level for teachers in Jersey, given the cost of living over here. Just very quickly, what's the employer's view of that? You're in Jersey is mostly small employers. You're a small employer. Well, what's your view about these? Why is there friction between these negotiations?
Clearly, one of the issues will be a breakdown in communication between management and trade unions, and I think that's always a problem. There's, as Anne's just said there's going to be an expectation set, and what's important as far as management is concerned is, what level of expectation you set, and have you communicated your expectation to the workforce, have the workforce communicated their expectation to you clearly. So a lot of it is down to communications. I think from a private sector perspective, what we're always looking for is, yes, let's, you want a pay rise in the current climate or whatever, we have to become more efficient. Now, I'm sure Anne will have a comment to make on that, but the point is cost of living pay increases right now in the current, over the last 2 or 3 years, have been pretty challenging for most private sector employers to find, because of squeezed margins taking place. And we're looking at the internet driving prices down all the time. So in the private sector, we're constantly looking for more efficiency. So I would say, yes, I think the private sector will be willing to give a pay increase, but it has to come at a price. It's not a case of, here's a pay increase and we don't expect anything in return. I'd be interested to hear what Anne's thoughts are on that observation. In simplistic terms, of course, it would be quite simple if it was just a case of private employers make a profit, therefore they can afford to pay more. In the teaching area, in public sector areas, there's no profit being made. So how do you quantify what people are
exactly, and all we can say is that teachers are doing whatever's required of them in terms of embracing new initiatives, and that is paying quite a heavy toll in terms of the hours they're working and consequent teacher stress. So there doesn't seem to be much relation between what teachers are paid and what is actually required of them. As I say, they're doing many more hours than they're contracted to for no extra pay. So teachers are giving, they're committed, but there's no commitment on the part of the State's Employment Board towards them. And I think the ultimate contempt is that the State's Employment Board have refused to speak directly to teachers. Now, all that they've done in terms of talking about being hard up is inviting us to a presentation from the Treasurer to the States. We questioned the figures, we had questions to ask about those figures, and we've had no reply to those, no satisfactory answers, so dialogue's really broken down.
Do you perceive this as an employer? Do you see that as an unfair situation, or do you see it just that's the marketplace, that's what
it's very difficult. I mean, as a small employer, we don't have this sort of intermediary handling a lot of employees. So we're directly involved with, as a manager, with your employees. So negotiation is one-to-one effectively. What I would say over the last few years, and it saddens me, but the reality is the deal that employees used to get compared to what they get today is definitely not as good. I think you mentioned earlier about the tribunal and issues about employment contracts, but one of the things that's come out of employment contracts is as they become more and more enforced and there's more law going on in this area, businesses have become much tighter as to what they will allow, what they won't allow. So in other words, you can no longer, as a business owner, for instance, just be flexible and say, look, guys, we had a great year here. Here's a bonus, or we did this. Because sometimes that can be construed as something which you did. Oh, well, you paid us last year. Now we're owed it this year, and that forms part of our new contract. So businesses have become very, very sensitized to not being flexible as flexible as they used to be because of the restraints of a legal system which is a legally enforceable contract. That's not to say employment law isn't right. It is absolutely right. I think it's important that there is protection for employees. But I think what's some of the outcome of that has been this lack of flexibility in negotiation. But of course, I'm talking on a small scale level. I'm not talking about representing a union group. And the question is if you're in that scenario where it's a much larger union and you're trying to make promises, sometimes you would like to offer something, but you daren't because you're frightened that next time around, oh, well, hang on, we got this time last time. What's the problem with having the same deal the next time around?
There aren't many trade unions of strength in the private sector. They're mostly it's mostly employees in the States or parish or in some capacity or other. Do you think that there would be benefit? I mean, you're a trade unionist. You would think there would be benefit if more people were in trade unions so that they could collectively bargain, as I think the expression used to be, so they can negotiate deals and they can be more certainty. Do you think that would be advantageous for people?
Well, absolutely, because otherwise the power is entirely in the hands of the employer. The right to strike is absolutely crucial because the only bargaining point a worker has is the withdrawal of the labour, and sometimes, apart from actually walking out of the job, which presumably the employer doesn't want, it's much better to be in a position to negotiate, but ultimately the worker has the right to strike, and that's a very important part of employment law.
In your experience as an employer, how do you perceive the trade unions? Do they help you? Have you been helped?
I've never actually had to cross a trade union at all, ever. So I haven't got the experience of what it's like to negotiate it. But I do hear stories from different parts of the world, about how at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is confrontation, continual confrontation. This idea that what the union wants and what the employer want are not the same deal. And I think actually that's incredibly short-sighted. I think actually both parties want the same deal. The employee wants a job which they can be paid a fair rate and a fair living wage. The business owner or business management team want a successful business which they can reinvest in the future and have a longevity to it. And what's so sad about all of these negotiations is that there's almost a perceived of we're trying to get one over you or you're trying to get one over us. And I just wonder where that all came from. It'd be interesting what Anne has to say on that point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the interests of the workers and the employers are one and the same. Everybody wants a successful business. But when you have a situation where the employer, in this case the State of Jersey, and specifically I would say the Treasury Minister has led this, is that they will provoke confrontation in order... Well, I'm not quite sure.
Whose benefit can that possibly be for?
It doesn't seem to be for anybody's benefit. It's not to the benefit of the people in the private sector because a well-paid public sector workforce can pump money back into the economy. It doesn't work to the aid of the employer because they're getting a disgruntled and demoralised workforce. It's just the bottom line, pounds, shillings and pence, where they're hoping to save money. And public sector wages is a huge tranche of government spending. And so it seems a very easy solution to look to that if you want to make savings. But it seems to me very short-sighted.
There are big employers, private employers, obviously the finance houses, some of them employ quite a few hundred people. But again, the trade union movement is not very strong within banking, as far as I know, or if they are, they're not very active in negotiating.
I mean, also, the other thing which you would say, you talk about the finance industry, I don't know if you're aware, but the actual finance industry employed more people, say, something like 5 years ago than they do today, and that's technology advances. That's stuff used to be done on this island in a clearing bank, which is no longer done. It's outsourced, or payments are made electronically now. There are all sorts of things happen in the private sector, which if businesses don't keep up, they end up with, and that dare I say we're talking about labour issues here, but ending up with a wage bill that they can no longer justify. We're not now talking about whether we can increase your wages by 2 or 3%. We're talking about, can we afford to employ these 4 individuals or these 5 individuals, because the job can be done much cheaper. Either it can be done cheaper elsewhere, or the technology enables you to do the job cheaper. We look at us all, we're now looking at self-service areas in supermarkets. A lot more stuff is done by us as individuals, which used to be handled by the state. As far as a business is concerned, we're now collecting taxes in ITIS. We're obviously monitoring who's qualified, unqualified. I mean, I'm quite amazed, in fact, the last 2 months, how many checks I've written out to the states of Jersey in some shape or form, whether it be customs, whether it be data collection, all sorts of areas which we never used to have to deal with at all before. So, that whole world is changing. I mean, we're talking about teachers here, we're talking about people training things. I mean, I have some sympathy with that, and you can't turn around and say, well, actually, 2 of you can teach, now we're down to 1 person teaching a class of 30. I mean, that's to the detriment of children and all the rest of it. The question is what value does a society put on a teacher, being able to deliver a great education system?
Of course, and we even hear...
So it's a lot more complex than simply a bottom line issue.
We hear simplistic things like postmen popping in to see that people are happy in their homes. In other words, a very minimal level of care, which is rather a new branching out for postmen, or people who deliver the post. So that's sort of, you can see where things could lead, can't you? There would be this multiplicity, multitasking.
It seems to me to be a way of saving money on proper carers. But going back to your point about the finance industry, I mean, I don't know the extent to which they're unionised, but actually the finance industry led the way in being a model employer, and I think the public sector had to chase them to a certain extent because they were prepared to pay high wages to get high quality.
Of course, a lot of that was due to the fact that the unions elsewhere, United Kingdom, had fought battles for decent conditions in the finance houses. The banks principally came to Jersey with agreed arrangements with their staff, and they merely brought them with them into Jersey. So UK conditions, basically, conditions applied. But I hear rather horror stories, I don't know whether you hear them, about banks that won't, or you hear finance houses, the staff mustn't join trade unions and that sort of thing.
I haven't heard that, but I'm very conscious that, as I said earlier in this piece, it's a lot more aggressive out there. There's a lot less, things like holiday pay, sick pay, I should say, which used to be sort of, well, you hand in your social security check and we'll carry on paying your wages. Now, actually, even within the finance industry, the sick pay check is the only money you get. You don't get, whereas there used to be a degree of flexibility and employers are a little bit more liberal on that front.
And lots of perks, paid flights abroad.
Which unfortunately have gone by the board.
That's right.
I think we're hitting at a fundamental thing about, the states of Jersey, what our expectation is as a society of the state anymore. And I think, and that's a really, really tough question because it involves human people, human beings who've got mortgages, who've got, bread to put on the table and things like that. And the question is how do you change? Change is so painful if you're trying to change very, very rapidly. And I think the conversation is almost of, well, what does the future of something like education look like? Are we still in the right area? Should we still be doing this? Should we still be doing that? More so than maybe, we're down the nitty-gritty here, we're the coalface here of, this person should be paid X amount instead of Y amount. I don't know if that wider conversation is constantly taking place or does that make any difference?
Does that take place in the States? They say, a surgeon gets this amount, therefore a doctor must get 2/3 of what a surgeon gets. Does that take place?
Well, I think a while ago there was, I forget what it was called, but there was a review of all positions in the States, and they were graded and allocated to a level, and the pay was set at those levels with differentials. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with some of them. I don't think a police officer who's just passed their sergeant's exams is necessarily worth the same as a teacher who has worked for several years and is the head of a major department. I think there's some skewing there, but perhaps it's quite interesting that within the public sector, the police and the prison officers are looked after better than the rest. I hope there's nothing sinister about that.
Not all teachers, of course, are in the public sector. There are teachers in the private sector. Do you represent any of those? Or?
Yes, in the private schools, but I noted that when there was a pay freeze imposed in 2012, St Michael's had put the 2% in reserve that they were expecting the states to give, and they did pay that to their staff. So some private sector schools pay more than the public sector, although I fear some pay less, but then people decide whether to work for less because the conditions might be
Well, there was a bit of a fright now that the funding for private schools might be removed, and that did cause the system, but obviously that could have an impact on the wages of teachers in the private sector.
Well, the fuss wasn't really about the private schools, it was about the fee-paying schools, the colleges, where the teachers do have the same pay and conditions as in the public sector. They are employed by the states of Jersey.
From your point of view, you're a trade unionist, you'd like to see more people in the trade union. As an employer, what would you like to see? Would you like to see more people in the trade union?
I think I'd just like to see more common sense being applied. I mean, I just think, for me the days have gone where it's, and I know there are always examples of poor employers, but what's so frustrating from where I sit is 98% of all employers are good employers. They try their best to do the best they can for their employees and try to get a balance on that. 2% mess it up for everybody, which is, I guess life's like that, isn't it? It's always, the laws are set for the 2%. They're never set for the 98 who get it right. And I think that's, for me, is the tragedy. And it's always this default position. We've just had this, not equal opportunities law just brought out, the
anti-discrimination
law brought out, and I actually had a bit of a debate with Philip Ossoff about this, and that was that the question of, is this a law really, which is it still relevant today? I mean, nobody smokes inside anymore, in buildings, technically we should all have signs up saying, no, you're not allowed to smoke inside here, but actually society has now concluded that everybody goes outside, and that smokers or whatever go outside. So in some ways peer pressure occurs within society, and I find very sad is that we always end up in this default position whereby it's the law, we have to create a law, and then that puts a frighteners on lots of other things which might be able to happen. Now, I know it's sort of broadening the whole topic out a bit, but it's
I think so, David.
Yeah.
I mean, Jersey follows the UK, and they've had a law for several years, and that's what made the shift happen. I think social attitudes often follow a change in the law. They don't lead it. I mean, people don't smoke in buildings because we've had the law for some time and we obey it.
And there is a spin-over for UK applied laws. Yeah. Obviously, what goes on in the media, what goes on the television, certain racist things are no longer said.
But I would come back and say the point is, yes, it's happened in the UK. People who come over from the UK then don't expect to come into a place where people smoke inside because, Jersey hasn't brought the law out. There's almost like a sense of, well, of course we don't do that anymore kind of thing. I just kind of feel social norms do change, but I don't always believe that it's the law that has to be invoked to create that change. Anne Pankhurst and it's all being meted out 100 years instead of suffragettes.
The real impact of the anti-discrimination law won't be felt at this stage. The real impact will be things like ageism and disability. This is when it's going to start.
But it does. The problem we have to get the balance between is entrepreneurship, and that is where you give somebody a chance to try and get out there and create something and do something and add value to society in the economy, to where you burden them down, beat them up so much by saying you can't do that, have you filled that form out, have you done this form, have you done this, to the point where you go, God, it's so much to do here, I'm not even going to borrow it. It's too risky to actually get up and get going. And I find our society, I don't think quite knows how to handle that, particularly in Jersey where we have so many small businesses. And actually the way out of this mess at the moment is actually to ensure that we have this bed of entrepreneurs going forward. But I know we're pulling away here from...
Well, teachers, public service employees don't have the opportunity generally to be entrepreneurial, do they? They are set very much within a framework and have to stick to it, and they may want to change something.
Yes, and no matter how good they are, how much effort they put in, it's rewarded to an extent, because to an extent we have performance-related pay, but you don't get a bonus if your exam results go through the roof, or anything like that. There are no direct rewards, possibly only punishments, because if your exam results aren't good enough for some period of time, you go into special measures managers and you can lose your job. You know, I mean, teaching or any public sector job isn't a job for life.
Approximately how many teachers are there in Jersey, do you know? All levels of teaching?
I would say between 900 and 1,000, probably, and it is more heavily unionised than other public sector areas because you know, there's always the danger of teachers having false accusations made against them, and the need for a legal backing makes them join unions. They're not unionised necessarily because they're militant. They join unions as a form of protection for themselves.
Are any members of your staff unionised?
Not at all, no, not at all, no. As I say, and I would say that would be very, unusual, hugely unusual in our part of the market, you know. It was quite interesting. I think a letter was put in the Post to tonight's JP, actually, I think, as talking about how, you know, we have some of the most relaxed employment laws and so forth and so on compared to if you look at our neighbours in France and things like that. And of course, some of the reason why you need this relaxation is to try and get the creativity, is to give people confidence to get out there and do things. I just come back to Anne's point. I mean, would you say actually you've lost confidence in the management of the educational establishment? Would you say actually it's poorly managed? That's some of the problem? They don't actually really understand?
Not within the education itself.
Right.
I mean, what's happening...
I'm not talking about educators, I'm talking about the people who sort of oversee...
Well, no, not the
department
dispute
directors.
isn't with the Director of Education,
Right.
It's not with the head teachers, the dispute is with the State's Employment Board, who are putting this imposition on the whole of the public sector and increasingly trying to what they call normalise our terms and conditions. And one size fits all isn't particularly good because, you know, if somebody needs a day off work for family reason, you know, anybody else can take a day out of their holidays, and I know much is made of teachers' long holidays, but they can't just take a day off when they want to. They have to lose pay. So, you know, you can't have this one size fits all between different people in the public sector. But what I was going to say, I'm sure you're a very benign employer and you have close relationships with your workers and everything, but you hear dreadful stories. I mean, I heard one a while ago about somebody who had booked holiday, who was going to take it, and then the employer decided he wanted him in the office and said, if you take your holiday that had been booked and was legitimate, you lose your job. And this man lost his job very unfairly. I mean, you know, as we've seen through the Employment Tribunal, there are quite a lot of cases where employers behave in a very unreasonable way, and you would think it would be in their interest to have a happy and contented workforce, but I think some employers need protecting from themselves.
I would agree with that to an extent, and that's for me that's your 2%, because I think, you know, what have we seen come into the workforce? We've seen maternity, a lot more flexibility in maternity. We certainly, as an employer, are conscious of the social demands of our employees to an extent, you know. So, like you said, if somebody says, we had an example yesterday, for instance, one of my members of staff said his mother and father have separated, his father lives far away, coming over to London, on his way out to the US, said, could I have a day off work, a day after bank holiday to try and catch up with my dad and do that? And this is very last minute, and it's not a kind of thing. I said, yeah, okay, I can accept that. I accept that is, for me, you know, if I put myself in his shoes, how would I feel if I turned around and said, to hell with that, that's too bad. You know, so I do think, you talk about social norms, I think actually to an extent good management is about treating people like human beings, you know, your employees like human beings, because I think in the end it pays. And as you say, it's a very short-term approach where you turn around and say cancel someone's holiday because it's convenient to you and not convenient to them. And I talk about the long-term view that employers need to take. The one problem we have now is, and I know one business had to close down, was because they kept their staff on for so long that they found that when times got tough, they couldn't afford to make people redundant because there was that much accrued money in their redundancy pay that actually they were going to basically take the business down if they let, you know, so it was actually cheaper for them to go bankrupt than it was to pay out redundancy to staff who'd maybe worked there for 20 years. And I begin to wonder, hang on, was that some of the law? Was the law ever meant to do that, where businesses couldn't flex their workforce in some way, shape or form? And that's not bad management, that's just kind of harsh reality of where we are in the economic cycle at the moment. So I think we can all pull out examples where, oh, this one wasn't right, that one was right, you know, they were rubbish there, they were great there, and I think it's very difficult. But I come back to your point about this one size fits all. I absolutely agree with you. I think there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. Each circumstance, and for me it's kind of empowering the management. So the question has to be is, how do the states of Jersey empower managers with a kind of, you don't want a rule book, a flexibility, or train them well enough to say, it is okay if you allow this, but you won't be beholden to, because someone's looked over the shoulder, well, that person got the day off for that, I'm entitled to this. Surely these kind of conditions need to be thought about.
This is why we're entering into negotiations, and, the States does have a very reasonable policy about what should be allowed, and I absolutely agree that it should be made fair. But what isn't fair is you can't apply the same situation to a teacher who cannot take a day's leave when they want to, and a member of the civil service who can, book their annual leave at a time to suit themselves. So that's the issue there, really. Yeah. But also, there has been a diminution in terms and conditions, and one of the things that was applied last year is a very steep reduction in redundancy pay, and now there's a steep reduction in payment protection for people who might lose a management post due to reorganisation. And these are things that concern us, because we're being told that any pay rise depends on these changes, and it's coming directly out of people's pockets, and not good for the private sector, because if you have a workforce that haven't got job security, aren't terribly sure that their pay is going to be maintained, they're not going to go out and buy that new car that might help the local economy.
I think you could argue that both ways, that couldn't you? An employee, in the private sector, and whether they have a secure job, if they have money in their pocket, they will go out and spend that money. So I think that argument can be done.
But in times of recession, though, a government can't control private sector pay. What the government can control is public sector pay.
Sure.
And sound economic theory is that you maintain public sector pay levels in times of recession. I remember a few years ago sitting and listening to Frank Walker saying, inflation's running out of control, times are too good, we've got to keep the public sector pay down. Now, you can't have it both ways, and they want to have it, whatever the economic situation, it's used as a reason for keeping public sector pay down.
These huge problems have a habit of disappearing in time, don't they?
But at a lot of pain along the way, I think, and that's what's sad. And I think, some of these arguments need to be discussed at a very grown-up level, and not Yabu, it's you, it's personalities. It's more about an ethos, and I think you're alluding to kind of an ethos of how we handle these scenarios. And take your point about keeping public sector pay up. What concerns me as someone who takes risk every day with our capital is that why is it tougher for me, I risk something every day sometimes, and then find, well, actually, the public sector are much more secure, being paid a very, I'm sure, vast majority of public sector are paid a lot better than maybe some of the people in, for instance, hospitality. Let's give that an example.
They're much more highly qualified.
Well, yes, they are. No, I accept there are areas, but I'm just saying is there are these differentials. So what I'm saying is, what I'm worried about is that public sector pay goes up here somewhere, private sector pay wobbles along here, and in fact, actually what happens is people are always looking for a public sector job because actually it pays better than the private sector. And I wonder again where that happens. Finally, little point is about obviously the pension issue, final salary pension schemes which are still in the public sector, which have long since gone in the private sector, and obviously are a huge liability to this island. And clearly, would your view be that if that was discontinued, that would be another erosion of workers' rights, of the right of the public sector, when these things have already painfully been removed from the private sector?
I'm going to have to stop you before you even start. So, thank you for your time.